Shifting focus away from Kartarpur to the United Kingdom, where Prime Minister Boris Johnson is speaking. Let's cut across live and listen in.
Both the Good Friday Agreement and the European Union itself. Third, we propose the potential creation of a regulatory zone on the island of Ireland covering all goods, including agri-food. For as long as it exists, this zone would eliminate all regulatory checks for trade in goods between Ireland and Northern Ireland. But fourth, unlike the so-called backstop, such a regulatory zone would be sustained with the consent of the people of Northern Ireland as and executive. They will give their consent during the transition period as a condition for these arrangements entering into force. Thereafter, the Assembly will vote again every 4 years, and if consent were withheld, these arrangements would then lapse after 1 year. Fifth, it has always been a point of principle for this government that at the end of the transition period, the UK should leave the EU customs union whole and entire, restoring sovereign control over our trade policy and opening the way for free trade deals with our friends around the world. And that is a fundamental point for us, Mr. Speaker. So under the proposals in this new protocol, Northern Ireland will be fully part of the UK customs territory, not the EU customs union. But there will be no need for checks or any infrastructure the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. Indeed, I have already given a guarantee that the UK government will never conduct checks at the border, and we believe that the EU should do the same. So there is absolute clarity on that point. Instead, under this new protocol, all customs checks between Northern Ireland and Ireland would take place either electronically or, in the small number of cases where physical checks would be necessary, they would happen at traders' premises or at other points in the supply chain. We have put forward a method for achieving this based on improving and simplifying existing rules, trusting certain traders, and strengthening our cooperation with Ireland in a spirit of friendship and sensitivity to the particular circumstances. So, while these proposals will mean changes from the situation that prevails in Northern Ireland, it is their driving purpose to minimise any disruption. And in order to support the transition further, we propose a new deal for Northern Ireland that will boost economic growth and competitiveness and set in train new infrastructure, particularly with a cross-border focus, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the previous withdrawal agreement and political declaration would have permanently anchored the UK within the orbit of EU regulation and customs arrangements, and an indefinite so-called backstop provided a bridge to that vision of the future. This government has a different vision, basing our future relationship with our European neighbours on a free trade agreement and allowing to take back control of our trade policy and our regulations. And we propose to amend the political declaration to reflect this ambition. Our proposals should now provide the basis for rapid negotiations towards a solution in the short time that remains. I do not for one moment resile from the fact that we have shown great flexibility in the interests of reaching an accommodation with our European friends and achieving the resolution for which we all yearn. If our European neighbours choose not to show a corresponding willingness to reach a deal, then we shall have to leave on October the 31st without an agreement. And we are ready to do so. But that outcome would be a failure of statecraft held responsible. When I think of the conflicts that have racked Europe in the past, of the immense challenges that we have together surmounted, of the 74 years of peace and prosperity that we have together achieved, I believe that surely we can summon the collective will to reach a new agreement. Mr. Speaker, this government has moved. Our proposals do represent a compromise, and I hope that the House can now come together in the national interest behind this new deal to open a new chapter of friendship with our European neighbours and move on to our domestic priorities, including education, infrastructure and our NHS. So, Mr. Speaker, let us seize this moment to honour our overriding promise to the British people: respect Brexit, yet amend this statement to the House.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of the statement. But what we have before us is a rehashed version of previously rejected proposals that put the Good Friday Agreement at risk, that would trigger a race to the bottom on rights and protections for workers, consumers and our precious environment. Given the seriousness of this issue and the vagueness of the proposals so far, can the Prime Minister tell this House if and when he plans to publish the full legal text that he must submit to the EU? These proposals would lead to an even worse deal than that agreed by the former Prime Minister. The Prime Minister signed up to the backstop in Cabinet and he voted for the withdrawal agreement in his letter to the President of the Commission yesterday claims both are now unacceptable. Perhaps he can tell us what has changed. Why did he support it then but oppose it now? The letter makes his intentions clear. It rejects any form of customs union, something demanded by every business and industry body in Britain and every trade union. They want to ditch EU standards on workers' rights, environmental regulations and consumer standards, and engage in a race to the bottom. Deal or no deal, Mr. Speaker, this government's agenda is clear. They want a Trump deal Brexit. A Trump deal Brexit that would crash our economy and rip away the standards that put a floor under people's rights at work, that protect our environment, and no Labour MP could support such a reckless deal that would be used as a springboard to attack rights and standards in this country. The truth is that after 3 years, this government still hasn't found an answer to solving the issue of the Irish border and the Good Friday Agreement. Where once the government was committed to having no border in Ireland, they're now proposing 2 borders in Ireland, ripping up the UK-EU joint report from December 2017. So can the Prime Minister confirm the government has now abandoned their commitment to the people of Northern Ireland, that they would ensure there is no physical infrastructure or related checks and controls on the island of Ireland? I'm sorry, I'm only quoting what the government said. Mr. Speaker, while EU leaders have been lukewarm, the response from businesses in Northern Ireland has been very stark. Glyn Robert, the head of Retail Northern Ireland, said the proposal would lead to north-south tariffs with, I quote, huge negative impacts on farmers and the agri-food sector. He went on to say, and I quote, it would also mean 2 borders requiring renewal after 4 years, surveillance in border communities without their consent, and checks north-south and west-east. Tina McKenzie, the chair of the Federation of Small Businesses for Northern Ireland, was absolutely clear. She said, all the promises of unfettered access have been abandoned. Northern Ireland is a small business economy, and this is the death knell for some of those businesses. Mr. Speaker, these plans are simply unworkable. Mr. Speaker, for what we have before us is not a serious proposal to break the deadlock. Instead, these proposals are nothing more than a cynical attempt by the Prime Minister to shift the blame for his failure to deliver. We can only conclude we can only conclude his political adviser was telling the truth when he called the negotiations with the EU a sham. So can the Prime Minister give a clear answer to one question? If he doesn't get a deal at the October Council Summit, will he abide by the law of this country, the EU Withdrawal No. 2 Act, and request an extension to avoid a disastrous no deal? Mr. Speaker, the government's proposals are neither serious nor credible. Labour consulted with UK industry, businesses and unions on the need for a comprehensive customs union, close single market alignment and robust protection for workers' rights and environmental standards. We need an extension for serious negotiations towards the sort of deal that Labour has set out. And then let the people decide, leave with a sensible deal or remain. The current proposals would damage the whole UK economy, and the Northern Irish economy especially, and would undermine the Good Friday Agreement. They would lead to a race to the bottom on workers' rights, environmental rights, and strip back even the limited protections his predecessor had agreed to. Instead of spending the last few months building consensus in Parliament and across the EU, the Prime Minister has put forward proposals he knows won't be acceptable either in Brussels or Westminster, and that would damage the UK's industry, people's jobs and living standards. Mr. Speaker, the only people who won't suffer are the Prime Minister's hedge fund donors who are currently betting against the pound and running down our fragile economy. He is doing nothing but seeking to divide and risking this country's future for his own political gain. An America First deal with President Trump. The proposals are unrealistic and damaging and will, as I think the Prime Minister full well knows, be rejected in Brussels, rejected in this House and rejected across this country.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I must confess I am disappointed by some of the tone that and the remarks that the honourable gentleman has made, because I think that this is a very good basis for a deal, and to take his points in turn and to take his questions seriously, Mr. Speaker. He asks what is the advantage of this deal over the previous withdrawal agreement, and very simply it is this, Mr. Speaker, that the objections on all sides of the House to the previous withdrawal agreement were based on the backstop, which, as the right honourable gentleman knows, keeps the UK locked in the customs union and in the single market with no say on those arrangements. And, Mr. Speaker, I listened very carefully to honourable members on all sides of the House during those debates, and that was the burden of the House's objections to the backstop. He asks a reasonable question about standards, Mr. Speaker, environmental and social protections, and I think it would be the will of this House under any circumstances to keep our standards the highest in the world. And the advantage that we have in coming out of the EU, as I'm sure the right honourable gentleman would accept if he reflected on it, is that we can go further. And there are some things that we can now do that have been long called for by the British people, for instance on animal welfare, that I think would be very advantageous. For instance, we can now ban the cruel export of live animals. And I'm sure that he will see that there are advantages that flow from this approach. He asked about physical infrastructure at the border, and I think I've been clear many times, and this government has been clear many times indeed. The previous administration, my right honourable friend, was absolutely clear that under no circumstances will the UK institute physical infrastructure at or near the border. He raised the concerns of businesses in Northern Ireland, and of course they must be at the forefront of our minds, and we will ensure that their needs are properly looked after, and that is indeed why we have made the compromises that we have for the immediate future, to protect their immediate interests. And they will, of course, he asked about unfettered access to the GB market. They will, of course, have unfettered access to the GB market, and that goes with that, and with no checks whatever. And one thing is absolutely certain about those businesses is that they want a deal, Mr. Speaker. They want a deal. I've talked to them, I'm sure the right honourable gentleman has. And I may say to him, and I say to the House, I believe this is our chance and their chance to get a deal. And I listened to what he had to say about delay and keeping this country in the EU beyond the 31st of October. And I must say, Mr. Speaker, that option does not commend itself to me. It would incur another £1 billion a month to no advantage whatever. I think the people of this country have had enough unnecessary dither and delay. They want to get Brexit done. They want to get on and do a deal. Mr. Speaker, this is a very good basis for the deal. I commend it to the House, and I hope that honourable and right honourable members across the House will support it.
Sir William Cash. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Welcoming indications of progress in these negotiations, will my right honourable friend agree that the overriding democratic issue is that the referendum result itself and the Withdrawal Act, with the 31st of October as the end date, confirms the sovereign and inalienable right of the British people to govern themselves, and that we need, in this country, a general election now and get Brexit done?
Prime Minister. I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, but of course the opposition has many times, at least several times, rejected the invitation to have a general election for reasons that I think will be apparent to most people in this House and most people in this country. We must leave them to consider their own decision. But what I can certainly tell him is that under this deal, this country will certainly be taking back control not only of its borders and its money, but also, of course, of its laws.
Blackford.
Yeah.